What's the origin story here? How did this all come about? Maybe David and Joel could take that one.
No, Timmy, you want to handle?
I had done the plays 20 years ago. That's kind of where it started. I think I performed when I was 25, I guess, Henry 4 parts 1 and 2, and the following year we did Henry V. This is in Australia, and we toured it around. So, I'd done over 100 performances of both productions, and it's just been on my mind for such a long time. And 15 years later, the opportunity arose for me to get behind creating projects and producing things and coming up with ideas for things. And I'd been asked about doing various movies that were like, period films that didn't really pull on my interest levels, my heartstrings, but felt reflective of and inspired by Shakespearean epic kind of tales, and it made me think about the plays again. And I thought, well, it had been 25 years since Branagh had done Henry V. Would somebody be interested in making a film about Henry? And that's where it started, and that's when I started having conversations with David. And the studio that I spoke to their credit, gave us the opportunity to write a version of that, and it was soon after that we decided that rather than just work with the text, that in order to make a film that wasn't so much a show of kind of empirical might and war as a sense of national identity and pride, that we might need to go our own different way with all deference and respect to Shakespeare. That would we be able to create our own version using Henry V as a centerpiece, and look at real history, borrow some things from the plays, but also take our own license.
David, what was your part of this journey?
Joel
Other than directing the piece itself.
Well, Joel and I live, we're very, very, very good friends. We live very close to each other in Sydney. We see each other a lot. And one day, I think we were literally sitting on Bondi Beach, and Joel said, "Hey, I've had an idea," and Henry V, and it sounded like a terrible idea to me. It was exciting to me because we knew actually what we wanted to do was something very different. It's not just about the kind of movie we wanted to make. It wasn't going to lend itself to a direct adaptation. That verse, as glorious as it is written for Elizabethan presentation. But also just on a thematic level. We wanted to tell a kind of different story to the one that Shakespeare was telling, which is the idea of a young, they're both stories about a young king, but our one was about a young, idealistic but kind of naive man. Rather than him just grappling with his conscience, he's actually being sucked into a kind of paranoid, isolated bubble of power, letting himself be manipulated by the cabal of sort of weird neocons floating around him. And so I actually took, knowing that we were never really going to be able to leave Shakespeare behind, it liberated me to know that for our intents and purposes, that's what we would be doing. We're actually just going to do our own thing. And so we never really even talked about Shakespeare after those very early conversations.
And so, Timothy, this is this particular incarnation of Henry V is, as we're saying, quite a very different departure from previous incarnations. And you really, you evoke these crazy conflicts and contradictions that are inherent in this character. What attracted you to this material in the first place?
David. No, well, a lot of things. I think David directed Animal Kingdom, which is one of my favorite movies, before I ever got a chance to do Q&As like this or got a chance to work on anything big. But then I love that almost all of David's movies, without speaking for him, deal with what we'd call now a toxic masculinity, and maybe throughout history were just the either evil or induced evil whims of men. And I read it and I really couldn't see myself in it. And that was very exciting, and I thought the script was excellent. But then in talking to David and realizing there was no contest with Kenneth Branagh or Laurence Olivier because simply because it'd be hopeless, and because I'm a young American, and they gave near flawless performances, and when David explained to me the language wasn't the same here, and this was the attempt at getting a searing portrait of a young man in circumstance that's too great for him, with a skill set that, in a level of experience and a level of political experience and familial experience that is no good for the circumstances at hand. And then lastly was the opportunity to, it's something I'm really grateful for just in my career thus far, that I feel like I get to jump into well-oiled machines, and Dede Gardner and Plan B. Not only do they make some of my favorite movies, but they had put me in a movie last year called Beautiful Boy, and thank you. And I guess I get to say Brad Pitt produced both of these, but that's a very weird thing to say out loud. And really, I got to jump into this Australian, creative circus that travels. With David and Joel, but our cinematographer who just fucking killed it in this movie, Adam Arkapaw, and Ben Mendelsohn as well. And then lastly, and I'll be quiet, I'm the youngest one here, people don't want to hear me, but that Nicholas Britell, who's sitting here, makes the most extraordinary music in movies today, if I could say that. To get to do this at a young age, jump in with people that are the best at their craft, just go in. It felt like a no-brainer.
Nicholas, here you've got this sort of simultaneous thing going on where you're evoking a sense of the past, but you're doing something that's very, very contemporary, very present, and also very mysterious. Can you talk about that strategy and also what your collaboration with David was like?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you, Timothy. Respect. I'm always fascinated with those early, those first instincts that you have when you see a film for the first time. And I watched the film very early this year with no music, and I think the first thought I had, and I'm not sure where this came from, but I said to myself, what if this were the 25th century and not the 15th century? What would that sound like? And I think there was this feeling of these are themes that exist for every generation to ask. These are questions of intellectual fraud, what's true, what's false, to whom do we entrust our power of the state, questions that are relevant for every era. And I was just wondering, what would a sound be that didn't necessarily feel like it was rooted in the early 1400s, but actually could feel like it was sometime in the future even. And that was some of the first conversations that David and I had. And David was totally into these kind of questions. So I started experimenting with what I thought might be very sort of strange sounds, like looking at the early 1400s like they were this foreign planet. So I took these bass clarinets and played them out of their range and ran them through this sort of tape filter, which created this almost like strange human sound. And David and I spent a whole week in March in my studio in New York where we were just really playing with sounds, taking metal and bending it and seeing what that did. But then I did a whole deep dive on late medieval and early Renaissance music, exploring even the music in England at that time, John Dunstable and the like. And I think it was important to do that, but at the same time, David felt very strongly that we didn't want it to feel period in that way, because I think then it made it feel like the story was really about the early 1400s when it really isn't just about the 1400s. So I think what came together was a sound that actually incorporated a lot of strings, which felt to us very timeless, this sound that could be in any era. And I think the harmonies and the sort of way that I orchestrated it is something that felt like it was inspired by some of the openness of that early Renaissance, late medieval period, but it also had elements of other eras too. So I'm almost not exactly sure how to pin down the exact harmonic language that I was using. But there was also a sound of a boys' choir, which felt symbolically resonant with the story of this young man becoming king. And I think that all came together in a way that felt right to us and represented, hopefully, many eras.
Can you talk about the physical production itself?
Yeah, I mean, this movie we knew was never going to be easy, and it was never going to be cheap. It was, and for that reason, it was always going to be difficult to make because it's not it's not Gladiator. It's not the triumph of good over evil. In a way, it's a story about a young man, a well-intentioned young man, kind of unwittingly being turned into a tyrant by the machine around him. But it was never going. When we first started developing this at a different studio, it was like we had an early budget done at like 110 million. And I was like, okay, how are we going to do that?
I guess that was Dede's problem.
No, we made it for less than half of that.
Yeah. So when
took time.
when we went to Netflix, they were still going to resource it properly, but it's like basically saying be smart about it. How are you doing it? How are you going to achieve this stuff? And in a way that I think it actually ends up suiting the way I like to work, which is it forces you to think, triple think everything you're doing. And go through the script again, triple think all the decisions you're making, because I always find that that beautiful things come out of that. I'm reticent to call it compromise because it isn't. It's just being rigorous in your interrogation of the material and how you are planning to execute it. But then every now and then something happens, like we've got those the trebuchets they're called, and I remember being in an early pre-production meeting with the art department. They said, "So how many of these do you want?" And I just said, 3, expecting someone to tell me at some point later down the track that you're going to get half of one.
And we'll CG the rest.
CG the rest. But there was never another conversation about it. I just
Brilliant.
turned up in Hungary a few months later, and there are 3 of these fucking things, and they're amazing. And we shot the shit out of them.
So can you talk to me about the physical challenges of putting all this together? You've evoked such an interesting post-medieval world. You've worked in multiple countries. What were the challenges there?
I think for this one it was Agincourt. Budgetarily, we realized that we couldn't shoot it all in the UK after we got that number, and so we had to find a rebatable place to do the lion's share of the production, and then we had to send David there in February when it was covered in snow and say, definitely find your valley, which he did, bless him. I would say Agincourt. For all the obvious reasons, the mud, the heat, the horses, the battle, the armor, but also for the safety anxiety, just a constant prayer every day, all day long. Let's all get out of here, okay? Honestly, because there was just proximity was intense for a long period of time, and wanting these guys to stay safe and happy and feel like they're getting everything that they want, and also wanting to get out of there okay.
And I want to thank you all for your comments. I think we're out of time.